I prefer to use the mesh tape when taping these seams because it's faster and it's pretty much foolproof. But another way to do it is to use a paper tape, which is quite popular and perfectly acceptable. But in order to embed the paper tape, you have to apply the joint compound to the seam first. A nice thin, even layer with no dry areas. So you just roll the paper tape out and try to center it on the seam. If you look closely, you can see through the compound and see the slight indication of where the seam actually is. Notice how I'm not pushing it right into place. I'm keeping it pulled tight and I'm pressing it in like every 2 or 3 feet. Okay, once the tape has been stuck in place, I embed it by using my 6-inch trowel. I roll it down, run it down each edge, cleaning off the excess joint compound and pushing the tape into the compound. It should be pretty much wrinkle free and the edges should be tapered.
You'll seldom be able to reach ceilings from the ground, so a plank attached to empty joint compound pails works for me as a homemade scaffold, at least for 8-foot ceilings. I still want to tape as long a seam as possible in one go. I cover the seams and inside corners that are within reach before I move the scaffolding to the next area. This bench works great, but it's kind of slow and cumbersome. I'd much rather use stilts for these lower ceilings. On house-size jobs, drywall or stilts are a great productivity tool, and it doesn't take too long to get the hang of them. But check to see if they're legal in your state and if your insurance covers their use.
Okay, I'm going to be starting the second coat on the ceilings first using my 14-inch bevel trowel and the 6-inch taping knife. Whenever I start taping, I'm going to put a little bit of joint compound on the trowel and then put the second coat on the screws first. Taking most of the joint compound off, just leaving a very thin layer. Because all I'm trying to do here is fill the indentation caused by the fastener. I'm not trying to build up the joint compound anyplace else. The reason I'm doing the fasteners before I do the actual seams is because when I get taping this seam, if this seam has already been taped, and then when I go to do the fasteners, I could interfere with this tape joint with the taping knife. So I'm trying to avoid any potential marks in my seams. Now, I'm going to start after I get the fasteners done, I do the interior corners. Okay, when I'm applying the joint compound with my taping knife, all I'm trying to do is get it fairly even. When I go to take the joint compound off, or to smooth it, is when I'm holding the trowel at an angle. If I hold it straight up like this, it's very hard to leave a little bit on. Most of it will come off. So when I'm smoothing it, I hold the trowel at quite an angle. Not flat against it, but enough of an angle to not take all the joint compound. I'm putting quite a bit of pressure on it. You can see the trowel bending even a little as I remove the joint compound. It's not just letting the trowel do it. I'm putting quite a bit of weight into it. when I'm actually doing the smoothing, I'm taking very little off. I ran that knife 6 feet and I've only taken off a very little bit of joint compound. All I'm really doing is smoothing out what's there now. If there's a little bit of, a few chunks of dry joint compound in the corners, I just take my 6-inch knife and scrape them off before I apply the joint compound. And keep in mind as you're doing this that this is a second coat. It's not the final coat. It's not going to be perfect. I could spend an hour on this corner and it would still never be perfect. So you got to walk away from it after a while. You can see that there are some slight wrinkles in the tape here. And that's what we're trying to get covered on the second coat. Making sure that those wrinkles no longer show after the second coat of joint compound and smooth it out. I've already taped the fasteners and second coated all the inside corners. And now I'm going to apply the second coat to the seams. I use my 6-inch taping knife to apply a thin coat to each side of the seam. Probably about 4 inches to each side of the seam, 4 or 5 inches wide. And get it as even as possible, about probably a 1/4 inch thick or a little less than a 1/4 inch thick. And keep it straight. And then this is when I use my 14-inch bevel trowel to smooth the joint compound. First, I'll do one edge at a time, smoothing the edge out. All the pressure on this trowel is on the outside edge, trying to get that as smooth as possible. I took off quite a bit of joint compound. Now I'll go over to the other edge and get that as smooth as possible, keeping all the pressure on the outside edge.
My producer was a little confused about what I meant by a beveled trowel, so I'll show you what I mean. Maybe I should call this a curved trowel because it's cambered or curved along its length so that the center of the trowel lays down roughly an 1/8 inch thickness of compound, while the edges feather out the compound to almost no thickness at all.
Now I'll take the trowel and apply even pressure to both edges, which will smooth the center of the seam. The edges are still beveled pretty well, and the center is getting smoother. There's quite a few air bubbles, so I'll have to go over it 2 or 3 more times before I'm satisfied with it. Checking to make sure the edges are still beveled. You're not going to get all the air bubbles out, but right now I've got just very few small ones, and that's fine for your second coat.
After the second coat of compound is dry and before I apply the third coat, I like to sand out any trowel marks or ridges or unfeathered edges that I left while second coating. I call this light sanding, and it only takes a few minutes to do each room. This light sanding makes it easier for me to apply a smooth, thin third coat of compound. I am careful not to oversand. I don't want to expose the tape or hollow out a length of seam. Some tapers skip this step, but I think it saves time by making for an easier application of the third coat and an easier final sanding. You don't want to breathe this stuff, so you've got to wear a dust mask. When you're shopping for these, read the labels and make sure the manufacturer says they're good against non-toxic fine dust. For the third coat, I always use ready mix compound. Unlike the powdered setting types, this stuff can be thinned down with water anytime after I've opened the bucket, and it doesn't dry out as quickly while I'm using it. These are handy characteristics for the third coat because I trowel it on so thin and then I trowel almost all of it right back off again. This much working would quickly harden a setting compound, which can't be rethinned. Also, the ready mix compound is softer and easier to sand than setting compound once it dries, but you still have to stir the ready mix to even it out. Just as in the previous coats, I tape the fasteners first, still applying just a thin coat.
One method for applying the joint compound on the seams for the final coat is with a 12-inch straight handle trowel. I just take the joint compound and apply it to the seam. I'm going wider than the seam by 1 or 2 inches, as long as you go wider. The idea behind the finished coat is to keep everything nice and beveled and finished smooth. So once I get a nice thin layer on there, I take the same 12-inch trowel and I remove most of the joint compound. What I just did there was feather that edge in. So I'm going to feather the bottom edge in, removing most of the joint compound. Now all I have left to do now is to clean off the center. I've removed most of the joint compound. The only joint compound left is what's filling in any ridges I had before. I notice there is a little ridge right here. And things like that I'm looking for as I'm applying the third coat. So I'll just put a little more joint compound on my trowel. And I know that needs to be filled a little bit more. So I'll just leave it on a little heavier. Most of it's still off. There's another little ridge here that I can see. And I just lightly go over that, leaving on a little more joint compound. And that's a good smooth third coat on the seam. It's the same idea when I'm third coating the inside corners. I'm putting on a layer of joint compound. Well, this time I'm still using my 6-inch taping knife. And then I'll taper the edge in, clean that right off. Both edges I like to do. So now my edges are nice and feathered out, wider than they were before. And I'm just going to clean the inside out, taking almost all the joint compound out. Now I do damage the other side a little bit when I finish both sides. And I just go over it by putting a little bit more joint compound in.
Now I add some water to the joint compound to thin it down a little. I like to have a thinner mix before third coating the ceiling because I can move more quickly with a paint roller. But don't thin the compound too much. 2 or 3 cups per 5-gallon pail is plenty. The compound has to be thick enough to stay on place when applied. It shouldn't drip off the ceiling. I just roll the compound on the seam, widening it out a little, applying a thin, fairly even layer. Usually, the entire length of a seam can be done at once. Now I remove the compound in the same manner as before. Seams on 8-foot ceilings can usually be troweled from the floor. You can get trowels with longer handles if you need them, or use benches or silts to reach the ceiling. Once the third coat is dry, I'm ready to start the finish sanding. I always use a good quality dust mask. I start the sanding with a pole sander using a 120 grit or finer sanding screen or paper. I've got a good 300-watt light shining tangent to the area I'm sanding. so that any slight ridge throws a shadow that I'll easily see. These screens are made of fiberglass and coated with a carbide grit, both sides. They don't clog the way sandpaper might. This is a switch box I'm sanding over. This is obviously the dustiest part of the job. Joint compound manufacturers seem to think that sanding is avoidable, but I know that a high-quality finish will require some sanding. Wet sanding would produce no dust at all, but it's slow and it doesn't get me the results I'm looking for. If you hate the electrician, don't bother to clean out these electrical boxes. But if you want to keep him as a friend, this is the time to cut through the tape with a taping knife and muck out the boxes. I'll vacuum them out later. Now I'm ready for the final touch-up sanding. I use hand sanding tools as I look and feel for any defects that I couldn't get out with a pole sander. This hand sander uses the same screens I use with my sanding pole. A dry sanding sponge and a folded piece of sanding screen help me smooth out hard to get at areas like the very inside crease of this corner. The pole sander works great on ceilings. I've got excellent leverage and everything's within reach. No drywalling job can be called complete until the mess is cleaned up. I use an old knife to scrape compound off the floors. I vacuum out electrical boxes, heating ducts, and clean up around window openings. I think the room looks just great like this, but most people prefer to paint. Unfortunately, drywall is rather susceptible to damage, especially while a building is under construction. Fortunately though, it's easy to repair. This is just a scrape, but the paper's been torn. I first remove any loose paper and then I cover the area with a layer of mesh tape and joint compound. I feather the area out with 2 or 3 coats of compound, avoiding a bump that might show after painting.